Hurricane Sandy brought mighty Gotham to its knees. And 1 year later, the people who keep this city running are scrambling to figure out how to keep it dry as storms worsen and the sea level rises. The Consolidated Edison Power Substation that sits at the end of 14th Street, right next to the East River, is about 6 feet above sea level.
The water and electricity does not mix, obviously.
Most of the electricity for Lower Manhattan flows through these transformers and relays, as long as they're not underwater. For over 50 years, the 11-foot-high flood walls worked just fine, until Sandy's storm surge pushed 14 feet of water over the banks of the East River.
Our 100-year flood design was down here, and the water's coming over this house.
The flashpoint was a circuit breaker that shorted out after the salt water rushed in.
That breaker was at a lower elevation, and as the water started to rise, that breaker flashed over and then caused a subsequent failure at the transformer. And so then you saw this big flash of light. Then there was a cascading failure because of the other relays, and then the station ended up being shut down.
Con Ed's Vice President of Engineering and Planning, Bob Chimenti, is determined to keep this station dry whenever the next megastorm hits. They're building about 180 aluminum doors to plug any holes in the substation's protective ring.
So if the same event occurred and that same storm surge occurred, there'd be no customers out in Manhattan.
And beneath the sidewalks, all across the city, workers are installing waterproof equipment.
Everything is all, even if it's submerged underwater, it's all submergible equipment. If it's underwater, it'll still operate normally.
And they're deploying more smart grid technology that can be monitored remotely and reduce power outages.
What we'll do over the long term is work with the latest climate science so that we're further protected in the future. As more information comes in, our designs will be flexible, that we can adjust, change, elevate different types of equipment, add a higher wall. We'll have a different set of options that will be most cost-effective going forward.
The electrical grid is just one piece of the vast infrastructure clobbered by Megastorm Sandy. On the west side of Manhattan, the phone company, Verizon, also got a climate change wake-up call.
The impact of Hurricane Sandy to Verizon was the largest impact to our wireline infrastructure in our 100-year history.
Chris Levendos is Verizon's Vice President of National Operations. Verizon World Headquarters sits at 140 West Street, about 250 yards from the Hudson River, about 5.5 feet above sea level. The ornate Art Deco lobby is normally gilded and gleaming, but the night Sandy roared in, it was not such a pretty picture.
We had water come in through the front and rear doors of the building, and then water gets into the elevator shafts, down the stairwalls, and begins to fill up the 5 sub-basements of this building.
In the basement is the vault where Verizon keeps its crown jewels, telephone cables. On that night, most of them copper. Bad enough, but below the vault is a pump system that delivers diesel fuel to the emergency generators on the 10th floor. But the pump was not waterproof. When it failed, the dominoes started falling. No pump, no power. No power, and these crucial machines stopped working. Air compressors. Verizon pumps air into its copper cables to keep water from seeping in. Water, especially seawater, destroys copper.
The network was completely destroyed with one massive storm and one very destructive night.
But there was, literally and figuratively, one glimmer of light amid the unimaginable mess. Fiber optic cables, long thin strands of glass that transmit voice and data with bursts of light, are far more efficient than copper wires, and best of all, they're impervious to water. After Sandy, the company started immediately replacing the entire copper wire network in Lower Manhattan with fiber. The changeover was supposed to take years. Verizon did it in 6 months. In all, Sandy cost Verizon about $1 billion. And that crucial fuel pump? It's now in a watertight room with a submarine door. Protecting New York's vulnerable and venerable subway system may be the biggest challenge of all. Sandy caused about $5 billion worth of harm to the nation's largest transit system. Hardest hit, South Ferry Station at the southern tip of Manhattan. The station was only 3 years old, built at a cost of $550 million. The day after Sandy, it lay in ruins. Joe Leader is the man in charge of New York subways.
The water level reached this high.
More than 60 million gallons of seawater came rushing into South Ferry, filling the station almost to street level.
You try and prevent it, you try and deter it, and that's the best thing you can do, but can you really actually stop it?
It was not for lack of trying. As Sandy bore down on the city, transit workers frantically fought to stem the tide with inflatable dams, sandbags, and plywood. But there was no stopping the water. Subway stations, rail yards, and 9 tunnels flooded.
Water was coming from everywhere. There was no way of stopping it. You needed Superman, I guess.
Mark Mende is the general manager of the Hugh Carey Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which normally carries cars and trucks between Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan.
So we abandoned the place. We basically pulled everybody out of here.
Oh, come on, we gotta go.
Here, there was little they could do. 80 million gallons of seawater gushed in. The tunnel was practically full. Work crews managed to clean it up. They removed the ceiling tiles and replaced enough lighting, cameras, and communications gear to reopen the tunnel just 2 weeks after the storm. But there are years of work ahead to get things back to the pre-Sandy condition.
We're just gonna roll it out.
10 months after Sandy hit, engineers tested a water-filled emergency dam that might offer a layer of defense for the tunnel the next time. They are also considering this idea from West Virginia University, an inflatable plug. In the meantime, carpenters have erected this plywood wall at the low point where the water gushed in. But in the long run, will plywood and inflatables and other small-scale changes be enough to protect this metropolis?
If I made this airtight and we did not allow the 66 million gallons of water that we pumped out to come into our system, where would that water be? It would be in the streets and would be in the basements and on the first floors of all the buildings surrounding. It's got to be a really regional issue to decide how do you deal with something like that.
In June, New York Mayor Mike Bloomberg released a $20 billion plan to make the city more resilient. It calls for several small barriers at strategic locations, as well as plenty of new seawalls. But it does not support construction of massive storm surge barriers like they have built in places like the Netherlands. Building structures that expensive and extensive would surely require regional, if not national, planning and support.